Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's Thrive in China Roundtable, where the topic for today is creating your cross-border e-commerce business model in China. About 2 weeks ago, I attended a CBBC conference in London with about 100 odd brands, UK global brands. And the feedback from that event was that China is still a country or jurisdiction, if you will, where brands are looking to expand globally. And I think with the pandemic, with the with the border control situation in place, cross-border e-commerce is really the only business model that a company can actually implement in this period in time. So I want to focus on that today. What does it take to set up a cross-border e-commerce model? What do you need? What do you have to think about? And all of that fun type of stuff. So let's get cracking on today's topic. So how do I begin? Well, first of all, what I'm seeing right now is obviously I'm hearing a lot of excuses on the market right now in regards to how do I get into China? How do I expand into China? Borders are shut. I can't physically get there. Well, the first thing that you have to do is build up an ecosystem of partners who can support you on this journey to create this cross-border e-commerce model. You cannot do it by yourself unless you want to do the quarantine situation in China, which I don't recommend. Then, the only other option is really to outsource and start thinking about an ecosystem of people who can actually support the business. So cross-border e-commerce in China is a very interesting market. I don't have the stats on the top of my head, but just to let you know, cross-border e-commerce only began in 2014 in China. So it's still a relatively new area of transacting and trading with China. There are government regulations that specifically support cross-border e-commerce in China, and I will be going through those a little bit with you today, at least the key points around that legislation. What is interesting about cross-border e-commerce is its evolution since 2014, where there was a lot of product smuggling happening within the first 5 years of utilizing this business model, and that now actually being eliminated by this new legislation, so that what you are importing is actually controlled, regulated, goes through customs, consumers have to abide by those regulations, etc. All right. On top of that, the e-commerce platforms have also their own regulations and legislations that they also have to abide by in order to make sure that everything is operating above compliance levels. Now, we are talking about cross-border e-commerce that is actually created from home. It is created from your HQ. So I want you in your mindset to think that you are creating everything, you're creating this entire business model based on the fact that you are sitting not in China. You are sitting in your HQ. So you need to have a support system, an ecosystem that is on the ground, that is actually going to operationally fulfill the cross-border e-commerce. Now, why do I say this? I say this because there are two things that you need to evaluate. One are your financial resources. Setting up a cross-border e-commerce business model is not cheap. Okay, it is not cheap to set up a flagship store on Tmall. It is not cheap to set up a flagship store on JD.com or any of the other e-commerce platforms. It is not cheap to set up a WeChat mini program. So you have to be sure of this business model, of implementing this business model. And the only way you can be sure is by actually doing data mining and market research as to the opportunities that exist via cross-border e-commerce for your products, for your business in China. If you don't have that data, how can you evaluate whether you can truly afford setting up all of this investment? And trust me, all of the TPs out there will highlight this. You will not get a return on investment within 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. It will take a couple of years until you see a return on investment. So are you prepared for dishing out cash to set up this business model, knowing that you're not going to get money in return to cover those costs for at least 2 years? So financial resources is critical, and the other is human resources. You cannot set up this cross-border e-commerce business model without having people in your HQ supporting this business, either having a head of China responsible for it and then coordinating with all of your partners. But you need people dedicated to this business to really kick it off. So the financial resources and the human resources, please, please do not underestimate that. Now, the first thing that you need to develop when doing this cross-border e-commerce business, this cross-border e-commerce model, is having an ecosystem of partners, of individuals, of companies that are going to kick this off for you. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, Kristina, that's all good and well that you tell me I need people, but who do I actually need? Okay. The first thing that you're going to need is marketing agencies, because if your research is telling you that the consumers in China do not even know your product, are not even aware of you, well, then you have to do a brand awareness assessment. You have to get known in the market. You have to get your products known. You have to educate people on the value of your products. You need a media agency that's going to support that. Don't make the assumption that you open up a flagship store and people will just resonate towards it. No, you have to make people go to that flagship store, okay? So think about the media campaigns, the marketing programs. Do you have a budget for KOLs? That in itself, just the marketing and branding aspect, is a budget in itself. Now, depending on how and when you enter the market, when you launch your flagship store, you might want to have a PR agency promoting you for that launch period. That might be involved with the media agency, the marketing agency. It might be a company that is completely separated. It's up to you. I've added inside here for you to evaluate. Then you need a TP. A TP, it stands for Tmall partner. It's an e-commerce provider. They don't just do Tmall anymore. That's how it started back in the day. Now they will be your e-commerce provider for any platform that you want to open up, whether it's a WeChat mini program, whether it's Tmall, Taobao, Koala, whatever it is, okay? Now, the question with these TPs is finding one that is reliable, that is affordable, that is responsible, and most importantly, gives you clarity and transparency over your data. The last thing you want is to work with a TP who doesn't tell you why you are being successful, that doesn't explain to you with numbers, financial figures, what is happening from a day-to-day, month, or day-to-day in e-commerce terms, day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month aspect. So just like there are thousands of service providers in China, there are thousands of TPs in China. You might find TPs that are specific and expert in your product and know everything, let's say, about food and beverage, or they know everything about cosmetics, or they know everything about fashion. Then you should really be working with them based on their expertise in your actual product category. You might find TPs that, because of the complexity of your product, in that it requires maybe specific product registration, CFDA approvals if it's food and beverage, or other type aspects, you may want to use them because they have more of an expertise on the logistical and supply chain side of the complexity of your product. It depends. But you need to set forth a criteria of what your TP is going to do for you. Many TPs now are also media agencies. They might also offer PR services. Evaluate what they're good at, what their strengths are, and what their weaknesses are. And then plug the holes, because what you're trying to create is a foundation that is solid for your e-commerce business model. But the TPs are a necessity. They are going to set up your flagship store. They are going to run your flagship store. They are going to be coordinating with your logistics providers and or distributors in relation to the order fulfillment. Okay. Logistic providers are also critical, and you do not have to use the ones that the TPs are suggesting. My suggestion is to evaluate all of these partners yourself, because this is a long-term journey. This should not be something that's short-term. You want to work with providers that are chosen by you, not just for 1 year, but for numerous years. So evaluate the logistics providers that exist in China. Evaluate those that are e-commerce specialists. They have the warehousing facilities and they have the people on the ground to do the fulfillment and domestic transportation orders. Evaluate their warehousing facilities as well. You can do that through video conferences where they give you a tour of their warehousing facilities so that you at least can see what is actually happening. And again, there has to be some trust and faith in terms of what you're being shown, right? Distributors, you may have actually started off in China utilizing distributors. Please make sure that you are evaluating your distributor who's probably doing offline distribution to whether he can actually do online and whether he has that expertise. He may be saying, I can set all of this up free of charge, but there's no point in him setting up free of charge if he's useless at it. And he's not going to give you any return on investment. You want to work with somebody who's going to be reliable. Now, there are a lot of distributors out there who are offering to start off the online sales and setting up the flagship stores. Again, that's all well and good. Evaluate what their strengths and weaknesses are. Now, you might also say, I'm working with licensees now, or I'm working with sales agents or franchisees, but we want to get into this online cross-border space. The first thing you have to do with those three is evaluate your contract terms. Do they have exclusivity to run all of that, or can you manage some of that? That's probably the first priority. Now, when you realize what you need in terms of an ecosystem of partners, the next step is doing your due diligence on those partners. Scams are well known in China. All right. So again, make yourself a checklist of how you want to evaluate them. The first thing I would suggest doing is looking at their business licenses. You can always ask for tax certificates, IP registrations, lease agreements to actually see that they're based there. And last but not least, this might be confidential, but hey, why not ask? Ask for audit reports and financial documents to see if they are truly capable of handling your business. This is you evaluating them. Don't forget, some of these partners may actually want to evaluate you and ask you for the same set of documents. Now, when you're doing your due diligence, it is vital that you ask your partners for transparency, i.e., what reports are they going to be providing you with on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis, so you can see your sales figures, you can see your costs, and evaluate your profit margins for China. Why is this important? Because you have to know if you're going to change your pricing at some point. They're not going to, the TPs don't decide that. This is still your business, which is why I say you have to evaluate your HR resources. You need somebody in your HQ supervising these partners to make sure they're doing a job well done. And if they're not giving you the transparency on the data that you need, how can you make decisions and pivot? How can you get rid of a partner? How can you lower your prices or increase your prices? How can you remove SKUs and add SKUs? You can't unless you have that data. And ultimately, you are the one who should be making that decision. There may also be cultural language differences. Don't work a partner that you cannot communicate with. In business, communication is fundamental. If you can't pick up the phone and call your partner and say, what the hell is going on? How can you do anything? And trust me, that might sound obvious. I do know a lot of companies that have worked with providers on the ground because they had one person who spoke English, nobody else in the office did, and that person then left and they were stuck. So make sure there are also multiple people within the company that speak your language, speak English, and can assist and give you that transparency that you need. But do that evaluation, right? Check your partner's company documents, evaluate their expertise. And last but not least, I haven't added it here, but ask for references. What other brands have they worked with? And call those references to understand, have they done a good job? What are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? And have a backup plan. something I also haven't added here. I have clients who work with 2 to 3 different TPs depending on the SKUs of their product line. So have backups. You don't just have to work with one TP. You can work with multiple TPs, depending again on the financial resources and budgets that you have. So that's the first thing, evaluating your partners, right? Evaluating who do you need on the ground to support your business, and you making the choice of who you want to work with. The next, obviously, is a very basic question. Can my product be shipped to China via the cross-border e-commerce business model? Now, you might not be aware, but there is something in China called the positive list, which is specific to cross-border e-commerce. This positive list is a list of all commodities, all products that can be imported into China under the e-commerce legislation and regulations, and can then can use the benefits of those e-commerce legislations, meaning lower tax rates, etc., to be able to import. It's vital, again, for your own transparency and knowledge level to know, are my products, are my commodities, are my SKUs in this positive list, so that we can benefit from the e-commerce legislations. Now, the benefits of the positive list is that if your product is within that, then your product will enjoy preferential tax treatments, which is a 30% reduction on VAT. And it needs to fit within the consumer spending allowance, which is 5,000 RMB per transaction or 26,000 RMB per annum. So any consumer in China who is purchasing through the cross-border e-commerce business model has a limit of 5,000 RMB per transaction or 26,000 RMB per annum under the e-commerce legislations. Now, I say all of this because if your product is not in the positive list, it does not mean that you cannot utilize the cross-border e-commerce model. It just means that you cannot benefit from the regulations and legislations, meaning there will be no preferential tax treatment if your product is not in the positive list. All right. In addition to that, consumers who have overspent in an annum, meaning they've spent more than 5,000 RMB on a transaction or 26,000 RMB in an annum, they can still import items into China through the cross-border e-commerce business model, but they will not have preferential customs duties and tax rates applicable to them. Okay. In addition to that, you can import your products either via the direct shipping model or via the bonded warehousing model, which I will go through in detail, without actually having an import license, also without registering your products if you are importing products that require specific product registrations. Okay. Now, in addition to all of this, there's a new regulation that was implemented as of Jan 1, 2022, which is if you are importing food and beverage items, then you do need to register yourself under the GACC regulations as a manufacturer or supplier to be able to then import food and beverage items into China under this model, under the cross-border e-commerce model. Okay. All right. Now, if your product, like I said, is not on the positive list, don't worry, you can still ship it. It's just that your costs will be higher naturally because you cannot benefit from customs duties, VAT, and you cannot benefit from customs clearance methodologies either. So just generally speaking, the costs of bringing your product into China via this model will be more expensive. Now let's start off with the two models within the cross-border e-commerce business model. And there's no right or wrong model. I think it just depends on at what stage you are in your journey and what financial resources you have and the volume of sales that you are generating. For me, the direct shipping model is really a first point of market entry. Okay, what does the direct shipping model mean? It means that these are personal parcels that are directly shipped from you overseas to the consumers in China. Okay, now the benefit of this model is that these packages are rarely checked. There are random inspections that will happen, but they are rarely checked. VAT will be passed on to the end consumer who is going to be collecting that package. You don't have to do any product registration. You don't have to do anything except ship the product from overseas. And this is all going to be dictated by your TP in China, who is going to tell you when you have to ship, what you have to pack and what you have to ship. All right. Here are two models of the direct shipping model, and I want to highlight both to you. The first one on the left is the direct shipping model, which is basically consumer makes an order online. The overseas retailer is made aware of it. They do the packaging. They do the international logistics to China. And now, just so you're aware, there are a lot of logistics providers in certain jurisdictions. I actually know of two in the UK that are only doing e-commerce drop shipping from the UK to China. That's their expertise. That's what they're doing. And there's more and more on the rise, to be quite honest with you. The shipment arrives at the warehouse. It undergoes customs supervision, but it's kind of like random customs supervision. Nobody really checks the packages. It might go through an X-ray machine. It'll go through customs clearance, and then there's the domestic delivery of the parcel directly to the consumer. The consumer will be then paying VAT, customs duty, to then be able to receive the packages. Now, another solution, which is getting more and more popular, is actually the direct shipping model, but with it having an overseas warehouse that is collecting your goods. There are providers, e-commerce platforms like Tmall, JD, Koala, VIP, where they have actually established warehouses abroad, where you can ship your goods to their warehouse in your country or in the territory that you're living in, and they take care of everything from that warehouse directly to the consumers in China. So again, it's a negotiation and discussion with your e-commerce platforms, whether they can offer this to you, notifying your TP that you want to choose this type of business model, and then coordinating that with everybody. And this is also why I say it's really, really important to evaluate the business models that are in existence, speak to logistics providers, whether they can offer it, speak to the e-commerce platforms, whether they can offer it, and then have your TP coordinate all of it. Now, some of the benefits of the direct shipping model is that packages are randomly checked, rarely checked. Taxes only apply occasionally, and if taxes are applied, it's the consumer who's going to settle it. You don't have to keep stock in China, so it's a great way to start off your cross-border e-commerce business model because you're not keeping stock, ultimately because you don't know what will sell, what will not sell, how much of it will sell. If the package is under 50 RMB, then there'll be a tax exemption automatically, and there's no CIQ clearance needed. CIQ is the Customs Inspection Quarantine Bureau. So those are the benefits. The disadvantages of the direct shipping model is that obviously there are higher costs and there's longer lead times, right? You have to imagine that if you were doing cross-border e-commerce and doing this direct shipping model, you were not selling anything to China between April and May because of the Shanghai lockdowns, especially if your packages went to Shanghai. If your packages didn't go to Shanghai, you would have been very, very lucky because it would have gone directly to another port of entry. But having said that, Chinese buyers are still really happy to utilize this methodology just because they are still looking for luxury items. They're still looking for real goods, i.e. not fake items. So consumers are still using this methodology. So there's nothing wrong to start off in China with this model, but realize that this is not going to build momentum. This is not a long-term solution. This is something where you can test the market to see whether consumers like your products, to see how it's going to scale up over time based on your marketing initiatives, and then decide whether you go on to the next model, which is the bonded warehouse model. Before I start that, just be aware of, I think, again, it's always a good thing. I mean, you can also play naivety and innocence and say, I'm not liable for the taxes, so why should I care what the tax rates are? I think you should care, because it depends then on what your price points are going to be. And definitely you should compare that to your competitors who are already selling in the market. But it's very straightforward. Taxes are imposed on 15%, 25%, 50%, depending on the type of product that you are importing into the market. Okay. If your products are not listed here, just message and then we can help you with that. But I just think for transparency purposes and for you to benchmark your pricing on these platforms, you should be aware of what taxes are imposed to the consumers. Again, conclusion for the direct shipping model before we go on to the bonded warehouse model is it's not a scalable option, but it is a great option to test the market. This is fantastic if you're trying to do A/B testing. I have one client who is using the direct shipping model, cross-border e-commerce, as a A/B testing for a period of 9 months in market, comparing it to the marketing initiatives that will be occurring, and to also evaluate whether there will be recurring customers coming in. So it's all well and good to sell to one customer, but ultimately the goal is also to sell to multiple customers and have recurring revenue from those customers, right? They are repeat customers. So the bonded warehouse model ultimately means that you are warehousing goods in China in a bonded zone, whereby you have brought goods onto the territory of China without actually having to pay customs duty or VAT on them. They are brought over from overseas in bulk, they stay on the ground, and once consumers start ordering from you, then the individual products will be cleared, or the individual packages will be cleared through customs and shipped directly to the consumers. Okay. So again, for me, this model only makes sense if you have scaled and you are seeing that the volume of the business is increasing, that it makes sense for you to have, I don't know, a 20-foot container in China. Again, to reduce the lead times for the delivery to the consumers. You're actually only improving your customer service to your repeat customers, right? As well as to your new customers. Now, in this model, there will be a customs and inspection quarantine clearance. And it obviously reduces the lead time, but only makes sense if you get a grip of the volumes. So again, how does it actually look like step by step? Basically, you see that the volume of your business is going up. You say, right, I've got 3 SKUs I'm selling in China. I'm going to make a bulk shipment of these 3 SKUs into a 40-foot container. I bring it over to China. It goes through a customs declaration. It's stored in the bonded warehouse. Consumers make their orders online. It goes through customs clearance, sorting and packaging, and then delivery to the consumers. Okay. Now, another option, again, that is being offered by the e-commerce platforms is offline stores are actually being created in the bonded area zones. So when you go into a bonded zone, which is usually a park full of warehouses and whatnot, you will find that some e-commerce platforms have converted warehouses into actual offline retail stores where consumers can go into the bonded zone, go into these retail stores and choose things off the shelf and pay for them there. Again, very interesting model. Interesting to see if it's something that you can expand on with the e-commerce platforms. Now, tax rates for the bonded warehouse model are very different from those of the direct shipping model. I've generalized it because it really comes down to the product category and type, but the tax rate and the tax calculation is usually around 9.1% of the value of the product as of 2019. Exporters need to pay an extra consumption tax if your product is in cosmetics, perfume, skincare, alcohol, other types of luxury items, there will be a consumption tax that's applicable. So that's the bonded warehouse model. So in cross-border e-commerce, you've got the drop shipping model and you've got the bonded warehousing model. And for me, it's like a scale effect. You start with the drop shipping, and as you see the volume going up, and hopefully also the value, you then move on to the bonded warehouse. But again, it's really important that you evaluate all of the costs that are associated with that supply chain and understand who's paying for what. Consumer is paying or you're paying, because the key thing for me with cross-border e-commerce is that you should be really evaluating your profit margins with every transaction that's occurring. Now, this leads me to another point that actually I have not highlighted, but it's coming to my mind. When you are starting your cross-border e-commerce business model, make sure that in your HQ, your finance team is creating a separate P&L for this business, evaluating the revenue from the cross-border e-commerce platforms and evaluating the costs of goods also from the e-commerce platforms and your logistics providers, and if any repacking has to occur on the ground. Okay, and then any other costs associated with China, i.e. resources that you might have hired in your HQ that are responsible for China, other types of resources you might have hired in China, like media agencies, PR agencies, or even just people that you've hired on the ground to be there without having an entity. Put that all into your P&L so that you can truly evaluate, how your business is going. And what you will find is that by creating this P&L, it will force transparency on your providers to give you the data that you need in order to understand what your costs are, what the revenue is. And if you're not obtaining that data, it means your TPs or your logistics providers are not the right partners for you. So when you're evaluating TPs and warehousing providers, logistics providers, ask them for templates of the reports they're going to provide you and the frequency of obtaining those reports, because that should all then be plugged into your P&L. Now, the next topic we're going to look at is cross-border trade and Forex. Forex is a huge issue in China. I don't know if you guys are aware, but there is a lack of Forex in China. So whenever you're trying to do cross-border payments, it can be lengthy. Applications have to be made, predominantly because taxes have to be paid prior to repatriation to overseas, as well as applying for Forex if there's not enough at that specific bank. Now, the payment methodologies that are used on the e-commerce platforms are usually Alipay cross-border and WeChat payment cross-border, allowing the Chinese consumers to pay in renminbi. Alibaba and Tencent will handle the currency conversion with your partner bank, and they'll apply certain commissions. So it's also really important to know what the costs are utilizing these payment platforms. Usually when you set up a flagship store, it's kind of going to be all automatic. Your TP's doing it. They might then forget to inform you of what these costs are. Evaluate these costs. This should be your job. Whoever's responsible for the China business should be evaluating every aspect of the supply chain and every cost that are associated. Okay. The payment amount will be sent to your overseas account, and a transfer will be made to the merchant's account once the settlement amount has been made. That's how the payment flow works on the cross-border e-commerce model. Okay, Chinese consumer pays using one of the platforms that's attached to your e-commerce platform. They handle the currency conversions, remit the money to your bank account overseas. The next, again, because I think it's just important for you to be aware of what the customs clearance procedures look like. It's a step-by-step procedure. During the customs clearance procedure, the importer will have to complete certain formalities. So if you are bringing in food and beverage items, don't forget that you as a manufacturer supplier have to register yourself under the GACC. The consignee of the goods, so consumer, has to do a customs registration as well. There's going to be a commodity inspection, which with direct shipping model is at random. With the bonded warehouse model, bringing it in bulk, it is done. There's a customs declaration, series of documents have to be submitted, examination, payment of taxes and other fees done by the consumer, the release of the goods, and then foreign exchange control is going to happen with Tencent or Alibaba to then pay you. That's actually all that goes through in the whole system of things. Okay. And again, I think it's just really important to go into the details to really understand what happens step by step, to then evaluate how you can improve on that. I always believe in using third-party logistics providers to support customs clearance, and most importantly, for you to choose that versus your TPs choosing that or your distributors choosing that. I think it's important that you choose that so that you have clear guidance and understanding around costs that the logistics provider is going to charge, but also that the logistics provider will educate you on the step-by-step procedures of bringing the goods into China. Now, benefits of the cross-border e-commerce model. I think the most important is that there is a pre-importation, pre-product registration waiver, meaning that when you want to import your goods into China, if your products are in a sector or industry that is semi-restricted, where you need additional licenses or you need your products to be formally registered, you don't have to do that with cross-border e-commerce, which means that you don't have to wait 9 to 10 months for your products to be registered. Now, this becomes important though, when you decide to expand on your sales channels and when you actually want to start doing offline, because at that point, your products do have to be registered in the Chinese market. But for actual cross-border e-commerce, your products don't have to be registered. There might be some minor registrations that are required if there are CFDA approvals that are needed. For example, you're in a category of medication, medical device, you might need something there. And you can always work with product registration companies that can do that for you. So again, do your homework, understand exactly where your products lie under. Are they special, not special? Do they need special licenses? Don't they? In general, I just want to say that there's a waiver on that. There's been a value limit relaxation, meaning that consumers can spend more on cross-border e-commerce. You know, per transaction is 5,000 RMB, annum it's 26,000 RMB. Trust me, a lot of consumers spend a lot more than that. It's just that they then don't benefit from tariff exemptions and tax reductions. Okay. If you fall within those limits, so also just to inform you, in the past, it was a lot less. It was like 2,000 RMB per transaction and 20,000 RMB, I believe, per annum. So they are increasing the limits for the consumers, which is always nice to see and very positive to see. But generally, consumers do spend more than that. There are tariff exemptions and tax reductions. So if you are utilizing the cross-border e-commerce, import duties, customs duties are either exempted or reduced. VAT is reduced by about 30%, as I mentioned earlier. So there are benefits on that as well. They are continuously expanding the positive list so that products fall under these preferential policies of the tax reductions and tariff exemptions. So check out these positive lists to always evaluate whether your products are within them and that your specific SKUs are within them. Free trade zone distribution centers are expanding phenomenally, meaning that you also have the ability, if you're doing the bonded warehouse model, to not just bring that bulk into one port, into one, let's say Shanghai, but to actually distribute that into several areas like Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, or even to the inland, so that you are reducing lead times to people in those areas regionally. So it's a very big positive that distribution centers specifically for e-commerce it's something that is continuously expanding. The last point I want to highlight is that with the US-China trade wars, there have been tariffs that have been set by both governments, which are excluded from cross-border e-commerce. So if you are importing from the US if you're importing into China from the US and your products normally would be subject to these retaliatory tariffs, they are exempt under the cross-border e-commerce model. Okay, so these are really all the benefits. And this is also why I say it is a fantastic way to start your business in China, to start trading in China with the border controls, with the fact that you can't get on the ground, and obviously with these tariffs that are then applicable. Now, a strategy, I don't want to leave you guys in the limb. So I have created a strategy, a 5-point strategy for overseas retailers, manufacturers, suppliers, in terms of what they can do as a next step for this cross-border e-commerce model. The first thing I would say is carefully design your supply chain structure and the related model, right? What you want is transparency. You know exactly that when your goods are leaving your warehousing facility, you know where they're going step by step until the consumer. Make sure you know all the obstacles that could arise at each of the junctures. Make sure that the operating model is fluid and smooth, and then evaluate also the tax efficiencies around that in terms of customs clearance, VAT, etc. The next thing I would say is build your ecosystem and do your due diligence on the partners that you have appointed to be part of this supply chain model, right? Make sure you're evaluating them, make sure you're vetting them, talk to references so that you know that you are choosing the right business partners to support this model. And then have a backup plan. Make sure that you have reserve, I don't know how to call it, but reserved partners that in case one partner falls through the holes and is not performing to your expectation, you can terminate the contract and have the next one who's in your backup plan come in. The next is having contract terms to really allocate who is responsible for what, who has the risk, what are the indemnities, and how are you protected as a seller? Okay, evaluate these contracts carefully. I highly recommend utilizing lawyers in China to evaluate these contracts and to make sure the clauses are written in your best benefit. People have the tendency to skim over this point and not properly evaluate what is really needed. And also evaluate then, not just with these partners, the contracts, but also ultimately with the e-commerce platform. E-commerce platform will be run by the TPs, it'll be operated by the TP. You should still understand the terms and conditions on how, if you decide to expand in China, you can take control of that e-commerce flagship store for yourself. Okay, because that will be done then with the Tmall's, JD's of this world. Now, this is where it comes into play, where I say you need HR resources. You need to have an internal compliance program to monitor and control the compliance of your providers. Okay, you need somebody in charge of this to be in constant communication, and not just to make sure you're doing it well and it's efficient and it's optimized, but also that you then get data from these partners to help you to create that unique China P&L so you can really evaluate how your business is doing. And if you are in the food and beverage sector, don't forget that you also have to register yourself with the GACC if you are the manufacturer of the foods and products. So make sure that's done as well if you're in that sector. So that's the strategy that I would recommend doing. And I mean, this is labor intensive, right? It's not just that out of thin air, you create a business model and you say, I'm going to execute that in China, because I don't even have to be on the ground in China. And I'm just going to delegate the work to the people. No, those are the worst clients. You need to take responsibility for your China business. If China is really an interesting market for you, you need to observe it. You need to inform your providers on how to pivot it as well, or at least have brainstorming discussions with them on how to pivot it. Now, the conclusion for me is very simple. If you want to create this cross-border e-commerce business model, it's because you're not looking to generate revenue in China. You're looking to give control to third parties, i.e. your ecosystem in China. And you're really looking to understand the market potential and test the market in terms of the interest for your products, your SKUs. sort of a, how would you call it? A tangible market research, if you will, right? You're not doing data mining. You're actually physically testing the market and researching whether this is going to work, but also doing it properly, that you are pivoting in that period. Now, for me, if you're doing it from home and you're generating this cross-border e-commerce model, you should always have in your vision, how are you going to expand off on that? Because this should not be permanent. You know, if the volume is increasing and your profitability is there and you're earning the right profit margins, why not scale up and become more present in market? Okay. If you want to do it in China, and this leads me to the next point, if you want to do it in China, you want to generate revenue in China, you want to trade locally in China, and you want to show commitment to the market, then you have to go to the next level and actually evaluate how you're going to do that. Which leads me to, how do you implement a domestic e-commerce model in China? I've started with the cross-border e-commerce model because that is usually the starting point for most brands, right? Let's face it. But you should be evaluating how you're going to switch that into a domestic e-commerce model, or even ultimately have two programs running at the same time, one that is cross-border and one that is domestic. Now, why do I say that? Because you might find that the consumers resonate really well with your products. So maybe you're going to evaluate new sales channels, offline, retail. You might even expand on the e-commerce side to say, in order to lower our prices, we have to go domestic to become more competitive with our competitors. In order to do all of that, you will have to do product registrations in China. So evaluate the length of time that that's required. You may realize that some of your providers have very clear weaknesses, and you want to move those weaknesses in-house to an in-house team. For example, you realize that your distributor who's doing offline and online actually is really lousy at developing marketing and branding campaigns, and you want to build that in-house. You might also say, I actually need somebody on the ground who's going to do the analytical work for me, because I need more analysis as to why we're working. I need more data on consumer trends. I just need data. So I'm finding that a lot of brands now, as part of their scaling up method, are actually hiring senior financial analysts to actually analyze the business on the ground, really from top to bottom, left to right, right to left, etc. All analyzing in all different ways and using the data and the numbers to do that. And then the last but not least is, again, as part of your scalable option and getting more domestic, is having local customer service in the same time zone, which maybe your TPs are offering that as an added value solution, or maybe they're not. But you have to evaluate whether it makes sense that you train these local customer service people and have really people that are in-house and stable. Okay, so this is what you have to think about from moving from a cross-border e-commerce model to a domestic e-commerce model. And I also want to say there are brands who have traded offline and go straight into a domestic e-commerce model because the products are already registered and whatnot. So you have to evaluate your current standing in the market, right? Your current status. So that's the end of the presentation today. I'm going to look and see whether any questions have popped in. So far, nothing's popped in. If you can write that in the chat box if you do have questions. In the meantime, how you can work with me specifically on cross-border e-commerce, we have developed a type of cross-border e-commerce mentorship program, which is a 6-month program where if you don't even know how to develop your ecosystem, we introduce you to partners. So we introduce you to media agencies, PR specialists, TPs, logistics providers, warehousing providers, in order to then get information, create that strategy for cross-border e-commerce, create that business model so that you can then execute it and implement it. We join those phone calls, we steer you in the right direction in terms of who to work with, and how to create that backup plan of other partners as well. So if you're interested in that, I'm going to provide you with my email address, but don't hesitate to contact me. Otherwise, we offer trademark search, trademark registrations, incorporation advisory, and all administration and corporate services that are related to really more the domestic side of the business, which is if you intend to set up an entity, we can help you with that and manage it and administer it. But if you are interested in the cross-border mentorship, then let me know. Sarah just wrote in a question. Are there particular watch outs if you already have distributors in market, but you're looking to set up an e-commerce model? Yeah, the first thing I would say, Sarah, is make sure you check in your contract with your distributors on exclusivity, and make sure you check on your contracts whether there's anything in them in relation to e-commerce. Then I would evaluate, does it make sense to use one of your distributors to fulfill the e-commerce side? If the answer to that is no, then decide whether you want to set up your own ecosystem to do the cross-border e-commerce, but that means that you are managing it and developing it. I have a client, a UK tea and beverage company. They have used a distributor in China for the offline distribution. And they then decided to start doing e-commerce, and the distributor said, I'm going to help you. I will set this all up. And he's done a fantastic job. And he's also been very open on his weaknesses, which were branding, marketing, but everything in terms of running the flagship store and the logistics and the warehousing, you know, it's done basically for offline and online in one warehousing facility. So what the company did then was they hired a brand manager, an expat who relocated to Shanghai, and then two marketing managers who also came in to really focus on marketing strategy, brand awareness, and all of that. You can create it in so many different ways with your distributors or without your distributors. It's up to you. I hope I've answered that question. Let me know if you've got another one, or if other people have other questions, let me know as well. And again, if you want to have a one-to-one conversation on this, you don't want to bring up your issues on a group setting, completely understand it. You can email me at Kristina@woodburnglobal.com, and then we can have a one-to-one discussion as well on that. Don't know if people are still typing, but just to finish off, we've got 2 more sessions. Next week, we've got a guest speaker, Sally Meyer-Yip, who's going to be coming in to talk about PR, the do's and don'ts of PR. And then on July 27th, we're going to be looking at trade as a whole in China. What does it look like to sell into China? Offline, online, and how you can create a business model encompassing both. Because today we just talked about cross-border e-commerce. So it's really looking at more domestic trade, buying and selling locally, importing, selling locally, having your own entity to actually trade with, and what are the advantages for that. So if you're interested for that. And I just want to highlight, I did an event with Ryan Malloy from Redfern Digital, who actually, he is a TP, as well as a media agency, and he went through the whole flow for cross-border e-commerce. So if you're interested in, and you haven't seen that episode, you know, log on to, I'll be sending it out today anyhow, log on and watch the last recording of that, because that might tie the pieces in together for you in terms of looking at these business models and understanding more than what he says. So do that. There's no other questions that have popped in, so I'm going to leave you at that. And again, you know, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm just going to leave it on my email address, Kristina@woodburnglobal.com, if you would like to have a one-to-one chat. I hope to see you all again very soon. Have a great day. Take care. Goodbye. Thank you, Stephanie.